Welcome to Lesson 2. This is the evolution of the regulations. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about how the regulations evolved through the history. From the 1900s, where it was buyer beware, right through to several severe incidences which changed the way the regulations look today. So where did the regulations come from? In the 1900s, the theory was the buyer had to beware. If you bought products out there in the marketplace, it was basically your lookout to make sure that you bought things that were safe for you. Chemicals, preservatives and toxic colour were used in an unregulated way. Things like formaldehyde were used in food products, which we now use to preserve bodies after death. Foods were adulterated. The milk was unpasteurised, it was often watered down. The meat was processed in very unhygienic conditions as well. The medicines of the time were containing a lot of alcohol. It could have up to 50% alcohol. It also would have had opium and morphine in them. So they might have made you feel good for a little while, but they certainly weren't curing any of your illnesses. Things that were out in the marketplace were mostly ineffective, some were dangerous, but all of them were adulterated. This is Sears catalogue, so it's a very reputable magazine, and it's advertising this product, which is called the nerve and the brain pills, and they're guaranteed to cure any disease for which they're intended. And you can see here in the red mark, that's all of the diseases listed that they're intended to cure. And just to give you an idea, some of the things that come into it are where you generally feel miserable, you've got low spirits, dizziness, emptiness of the stomach, specks before the eyes, if you've got chest or back pain, if there's a feeling of dread around you, if you've got slow circulation, and it goes on and on and on and on. So it just gives you an example as to the type of advertisements that were out at the time. And you'll notice there's no warnings, there's no provisos in this. It's just an amazing product that's going to cure all of these things. The doctrine was you looked out for yourself, tough luck on you if you got a product that was substandard. The labels didn't have to list ingredients or warnings. Useless things were promoted as being the cure for every disease and for every symptom. Things started to change. In 1901, there was the diphtheria antitoxin contamination. So in 1901, 13 children in St. Louis died when they received a diphtheria antitoxin. It was contaminated with tetanus spores. This tragedy spurred the Congress into passing the Biologics Control Act, so this was the first of the laws of its time. Licenses were issued to pharmaceutical firms for making smallpox and rabies vaccines, among others. And they started looking into new fields such as immunology so that they could understand sudden deaths that sometimes followed repeated injections of biologics, where they were prepared in a foreign protein media such as horse serum. So there's starting to be more investigation into how medicines are produced and how they're being manufactured. A big breakthrough in how things were done was after a book called The Jungle. The Jungle was written by Upton Sinclair in Chicago, so he was nicknamed as a muckraker. He wrote the book mainly about the Chicago meatpacking industry, and the purpose of it was to bring about change to the miserable conditions of the factory workers of the time. They were working with very unsanitary conditions, and the mincemeat sometimes had poisoned rat in it. Workers who fell into the machinery, sometimes they just kept processing and processing through it. Diseased animals were slaughtered and sold, so it was a pretty horrific industry at the time. In 1906, there was obviously an outcry from consumers when they got hold of this, because excerpts of it were published in the media of the time, in the newspapers. So Upton Sinclair was called the father of consumerism. The meat consumption decreased, as you can imagine, by 50% overnight, and there was outcry for some more protection laws for the consumers. It led to the establishment of the precursor to what we now know as the Food and Drug Agency, the FDA. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act came into being. Here it stressed that drugs had to be pure. It forbade you selling adulterated or misbranded food or drugs. It also prohibited you removing nutritional constituents like the vitamins and the minerals. You weren't allowed to take them out to extend your shelf lives anymore. It required your labelling to be true and accurate with the numerical or weight in place. It required you to label and to state if there was alcohol or narcotics in your products. And it prohibited you labelling medicines with false therapeutic claims. So you could no longer claim that it was going to cure all the things that it was announced for. You had to show the labelling, you had to show how much of the weight, the measure, or the numerical count was in the bottle or the capsule. In 1937, we had a tragedy known as the elixir of sulfonamide tragedy. Sulfonamide was a powder that was mixed with water, and it was commonly used to treat streptococcal infections. There wasn't many antibiotics at the time, so it was very popular and it was used a lot. Up to 1937, it was available as a powder, and you could get it as a tablet as well. But in 1937, a company called S.C. Massengill, they wanted to develop a liquid form of this product, and they were aiming it at the children's market. They gave it a nice appearance and a lovely, pleasant taste. 240 gallons of this product were shipped out onto the marketplace, and after 2 weeks, the drug started to get complaints about it. 107 people died as a result of taking this drug, and a lot of those were actually children. What they had done was they had used diethylene glycol as a solvent for the elixir, and it is poisonous to humans because it's otherwise known as antifreeze, so they used the wrong solvent. The recall of this product was really difficult because at the time there was no capability of tracking where individual batches had ended up. So it was really hard for them to get those products back. It took weeks of door-to-door research. No studies were performed at the time to show that the new formulation was safe. There was no law requiring animal studies or clinical trials to take place. So product was just allowed to be released onto the market. The only penalty that they had was that they were fined for misbranding the product because they called it an elixir, which means that it contains alcohol, and it didn't actually contain alcohol. That's what they ended up getting fined on. That was the only law they had broken, even though their product had resulted in the deaths of 107 people. So in 1938, the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act had to be amended as a result of this tragedy. So it extended the remit of the FDA to include cosmetics and medical devices also. It was the first time authorised factory inspections came into place, and they had penalties then for problems with non-compliance. It eliminated the requirement of proof of intent to defraud and mislabelling. So the onus now was gone from the consumer to prove that a product was mislabeled or unsafe, and now it was coming back onto the manufacturer. Prior to marketing the products, they now had to demonstrate that they were safe, that the strength was correct, that the identity was correct, that it was what it said it was, and that the purity was right. So now we have an intent to ensure value to consumer. There's still a little loophole in this law. There still is no requirement for products to be effective. In 1960s, the thalidomide disaster occurred. Thalidomide was marketed in Europe as a sleeping pill from 1957 to 1961. And doctors noticed that it was an effective antiemetic for pregnant women, so they started prescribing it to reduce morning sickness. It only happened in Europe because the company applied for a marketing license to the US in 1960 and it was refused. So thalidomide had 2 enantiomers to it, and one of those was a tetraton, which means that it's dangerous for an unborn child. The FDA found safety data was insufficient, and they requested more tests, and they didn't grant them a license to market in the United States. They were continually dissatisfied with the evidence that was being submitted, and the product was never released into the States. Eventually in Europe, the connection was made between the ingestion of thalidomide and congenital defects, short arms and short legs, and babies being born as a result. 10,000 to 15,000 children were born with defects, and many of their children's children, are still suffering with these defects as a result. Thalidomide was withdrawn from the market in November 1961. It was reauthorized as a leprosy drug, however. So thalidomide was approved for use in Europe, but not in the US. And as I said before, that was due to the insufficient evidence that they received from the company manufacturing the drug. Dr. Frances Kelsey was the person from the FDA who was working on it, and she received the President's Medal for preventing the thalidomide disaster reaching the US. This tragedy brought about amendments to the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act in 1962, as you might expect, and it led to the birth of the GMP regulations as we pretty much know them now. In 1962, the regulations were tightened further with the Kaufer-Harris Amendment to the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1962, and this is the first time we saw substantial evidence being required to come out of clinical trials to show that a product was both safe and effective. And the FDA Act from 1938 only required that it was safe, so now we have to show that a drug is effective as well. It brought into line FDA approval prior to marketing as well. Previously, if the FDA didn't act on an application within 60 days, there was an automatic approval. Now you had to physically get your approval from the FDA before you were allowed to market a product. Adherence to CGMPs was now a requirement, and there was closer monitoring of clinical trials, and participants coming to those trials had to have informed consent, so they couldn't be in a part of a trial without their knowledge. Also, side effects had to be disclosed in the regulations, and in the advertising, sorry. So if you've ever been to the United States, you'll see that they have a lot of advertisement on the television for different types of drugs. They're allowed to advertise directly to the public. And you will see part of that is they have to list all the side effects that are possible as a result of taking the medication. There's also monitoring and reporting of post-marketing safety and information. So if a consumer makes a complaint about a product, or a GP or a pharmacist makes a complaint about a product, that's tracked, and the side effects that they have informed about are investigated and checked to see if they're a result from the product itself. So we're back to you. Take a couple of minutes now to just go through the content of this course and see if you can answer the following questions. So why do we have GMPs? What were the critical events that helped the GMPs to evolve? Prior to the thalidomide disaster, what was the major loophole in the regulations for introducing a new drug? What were the key changes arising from the Cofer-Harris Amendment? Thanks for your time. We'll see you for lesson 3.